thanks for coming again or for sticking around. So I want to sort of pick up where we left before the break, and I want to sort of echo something that Thomas said in his comments about sort of the need to address like more serious forms of scientism in addition to those popular level and sometimes sort of crazy seeming forms of scientism. So I guess what I tried to do yesterday was really look at the popular versions of scientism that there are. What I want to do today is look at least one sort of more serious version of scientism that has been put forward in the literature, or in fact that's sort of forthcoming in the literature. And I also want to say something in sort of concluding about what's the alternative to scientism? So how can we hold science in high regard without adopting a form of scientism? But first critique of scientism and then something more about that. Now, so as we've heard a number of times yesterday and today, there are many different versions of scientism. So let me just be clear about the kind of version that I'm going to be talking about. It's going to be a version of epistemological scientism. And this is more or less what I had up on the slide yesterday as sort of a popular version of scientism. And you see this in Alex Rosenberg, perhaps in Richard Dawkins too, as we saw this morning. And it says that science is the only source of rational beliefs or knowledge about ourselves and the world. Now, I think it's actually quite easy to see that this is too crude as it stands. So first of all, as a descriptive claim, so that science is in fact the only source of rational beliefs or knowledge about ourselves and the world, it seems simply false, right? For all of us, it's going to be the case that we rely not just on scientific beliefs, but also on lots of beliefs we form not by means of scientific inquiry, but by sort of simple everyday perception, by memory, by listening to others. Okay, so you might sort of reject all of those beliefs as being rational ones or constituting knowledge, but that seems like an extremely skeptical and sort of kind of crazy position. So as it stands, this seems too easy a target to criticize, really. I mean, nobody actually sort of believes this, and at least nobody can live by this sort of view, it seems. So how about this? Sort of we change it a little bit, and the idea being that it's not the only source, but it's sort of a superior source. So there may be other sources of rational beliefs and knowledge, but they're not as good as scientific knowledge, scientific beliefs. And of course, the sense of goodness here has to do with epistemic goodness. So sort of better in terms of truth-conducive qualities, justifications, or grounds that we have for believing these beliefs are likely to be true. So epistemic quality. And then the thought would be science is sort of the best form of epistemic machinery that we have. So if we really are interested in learning the truth about the world, in acquiring the best sort of beliefs that we can have, we should rely on science. And this is going to be true for beliefs about ourselves, or beliefs about the world, beliefs about everything. So I think this is better. And it's sort of closer to sort of a piece of advice that people could actually try to follow. I mean, it doesn't say that you can only rely on science. It just says that the best thing to do is to rely on science, so where it is available. If there's no sort of science available, you can acquire rational beliefs or knowledge from other sources, but it's not as good as scientific sources. One thing that this doesn't quite capture is what you might call sort of a more dynamic aspect that there may be to scientism. Because I mean, what I mean by this is this. Well, as we all know, it's sort of easy to see that current science certainly doesn't address sort of every question we might be interested in. There are lots of domains that we form beliefs about, and that current science has very little to say about. And I'm thinking here of sort of the humanities. There are lots of issues that people talk about in the humanities where sort of science or the methods of natural science don't really say anything, at least yet. But you might think, well, perhaps as science progresses in the future, it might come to address those issues. Maybe by sort of adopting slightly different methods than current science is using, maybe by sort of developing new methods that are more suitable to the questions that are asked in these domains. So that's sort of the thought. Science could expand. And this is something that Michael has also talked about, and he calls it scientific expansionism. So it would actually be even better in characterizing scientism if we sort of build that into the definition. So the thought would be that there are no limits, at least no in principle or a priori limits to where science can go. And this sort of brings us to a characterization of scientism that is put forward in a forthcoming paper, actually the paper that's forthcoming in the collection that a number of colleagues and I are editing on scientism. And it's put forward by James Ladyman. So we heard more about James Ladyman this morning. Here's sort of his version of scientism, and he calls this a, what does he call it? I think a humane form of scientism. So this is supposed to be more modest and more plausible than these wild and crazy claims you find in the popular literature. So I'll read it to you first. So science is absolutely authoritative as a source of knowledge, and there are no in principle or a priori limits on the domain of science. So what does he mean by absolutely authoritative? Well, it means what I sort of said in discussing the previous slide. Science is the best source of knowledge that we have. So other sources may have some authority, but the authority they have is not as good or not as strong as that of science. So it's perfectly okay to rely on other sources of beliefs until science comes in, as it were. Right? So once there's scientific knowledge available about a given topic, we should abandon other beliefs that we have based on common sense, based on tradition, based on, well, what have you. So to the extent that there is scientific knowledge available, we should rely on that rather than anything else. What about the idea that there are no limits to science? Well, this sort of incorporates the dynamical aspect of scientism that I just talked about. So it means that there's no saying in advance what science, future science that is, there's no saying in advance where future science might go and what sort of things it might develop insights on. So we can't simply protect some corner of our beliefs from science. No part of what we believe is forever safe from science. So it doesn't say that current science has a lot to say on religion, on morality, on things that are going on in the humanities, but future science might. Right? So it's this is open. So it's open to future developments of science. Now, let me emphasize how this version of scientism is both moderate, but still has real bite. So it's also, recognizably a form of scientism, and hence a substantive and distinctive thesis that people might be interested in analyzing and evaluating. So it's moderate in the sense that it doesn't say anything to the effect that science is guaranteed to deliver insights on everything we want to know. So it doesn't claim that science will eventually replace ethics, or that it will replace religion, or that it will wipe out the humanities or something. It might, but it might not. It's just that when it starts to address these issues, we had better pay attention. But perhaps nothing might come of it. So that's left open by this definition. Also, it's moderate in the sense that it doesn't downgrade or dismiss other forms of inquiry, other modes of forming belief entirely. It just says that they're not as good as science. Right? So science is the best thing we have if we want to form beliefs, but it's okay to rely on other ways of forming beliefs too. At least as long as they don't conflict with science, because in a case of conflict, science is going to win, or should win. And also it doesn't, so this form of scientism doesn't really put current science on a pedestal. So it doesn't say current science is completely correct, or that that we should rely on everything current science says. It's very much open to sort of future changes in what science tells us. Perhaps even radical changes. I mean, that's sort of left open by this definition. So you might think that this is sort of a vulnerability of the definition here, because, I mean, if this is open to any sorts of developments of future science, maybe it's kind of empty, right? Because you can always say, oh, you know, this is not something current science teaches us, but I strongly believe that this is where future science will go. And that way you could sort of maintain nominal commitment to scientism by emphasizing, you know, speculative things about the future of science. So there's sort of a risk here in leaving it open, but maybe you might sort of supplement this by saying, well, you know, there are certain parts of current science that are very unlikely to be replaced. Maybe sort of, you know, the standard model in particle physics, you know, seems really safe. Certain things about cosmology, evolution. All right, so let's sort of leave it for what that is. So I said it's moderate in a number of ways. Nonetheless, it's still a substantive and controversial thesis. It's really sort of, you know, it has real bite. First of all, because it affirms that science is absolutely authoritative, right? And so there's sort of a strong claim there. Science admits of no rivals. It's the only thing that we should rely on if it's available. Of course, I mean, the adherent of scientism builds in sort of the usual qualifications about science being fallible, about some scientific theories being sort of provisional. So, I mean, that's all sort of, I mean, that's a move that the adherent of scientism is going to want to make. But as far as it concerns established science, or firmly established science, that's the sort of thing we should rely on. So it also means, so it has real bite also in the sense that if you adhere to this definition, this characterization of scientism, it means that you should always pay attention when science is developing or when new scientific insights become available. It's not something you can just ignore as irrelevant or unimportant, because it is this absolutely authoritative source of knowledge. And it's also sort of a strong thesis in the sense that nothing is sort of forever protected or in principle off limits for science. Science might go anywhere. So there's a real sort of openness to radical changes in our views as a result of scientific progress. So I think this is actually sort of a version of scientism in sort of, you know, explaining this version of it. I'm trying to be charitable. So I'm trying to, you know, show you a version of scientism that is not sort of crazy and radical to the point of being completely undefensible, but that's actually, you know, it's moderate in a certain way. It has, I mean, there's something to be said for this version. So I'm trying to sort of grant my opponent a strong version of scientism, and then I want to look at whether this is really sort of a feasible version. And of course, you know, it is in fact a version that has been put forward by a proponent of scientism, which, you know, is always a good thing, because it means that I'm not attacking a straw man, I'm attacking sort of an actual person who holds this view. Okay, so I'll focus here in this talk mostly on the idea that science is this absolutely authoritative source of knowledge. I mean, there might be other things to say about the idea that there are no in principle limits to science, but I won't address them today. Okay, and basically what I want to do is offer 3 criticisms of this view. And I think each criticism individually is pretty strong, and taken together they're even stronger. First criticism. Science necessarily relies on non-scientific knowledge. What do I mean by that? Well, there are our ordinary, everyday ways of forming beliefs. Visual perception, you know, our sense of smell, taste, our sense of touch. All of these are ways through which we form beliefs. There is a priori reasoning. There's sort of mathematical, conceptual logical forms of reasoning. There's memory, there is testimony, there is something called proprioperception, through which we are sort of aware of where our body parts are. And all of these things, at least on the face of it, seem like non-scientific ways of forming beliefs, or sort of extra science. They're outside of science, and they're nonetheless ways of forming beliefs. In fact, they seem very much like ways of forming knowledge. When you look at something and conditions are normal, it's daylight and you see it clearly, and there's nothing sort of weird going on. It seems you can come to know things simply by looking at them, right? You can sort of see that there's a tree outside your window. Very sort of mundane, everyday sorts of situations, but nonetheless very much look like cases of knowledge. Additionally, you might think, well, science must also presuppose these very general truths about the world, such as, first of all, that there is an external world, that the world is more or less a regular place so that it can be studied successfully in science. That inductive reasoning, or at least some forms of it, are valid. So this is something that philosophers have talked a lot about. And I don't want to emphasize these too much, because some people say, well, science doesn't need to really assume these things. It can just sort of work with them as working hypotheses or something. And then, in actually doing science, we get indirect confirmation for the truth of these working hypotheses. So it's not something that science really strictly needs to assume. Maybe that's right. Anyway, so I want to focus mainly on these ordinary ways of forming beliefs and knowledge. So why do I say that science must rely on them? Well, imagine trying to do science without relying on them. So try to do science without relying on ordinary perception, without relying on memory, without relying on testimony. There's not a lot that could happen, right? How do you do science if you can't rely on your sort of visual perception? And you look at some sort of measuring apparatus and you see something, but you're not going to rely on that in doing science. This is impossible, right? So it seems that science really needs these extra scientific modes of forming beliefs. So that's the basic criticism. Now I want to look at a number of modifications or qualifications or objections that people might want to raise to what I said in this criticism here. So the first worry. You might think, well, sure. Of course, science takes these everyday ways of forming beliefs as input. But that isn't to say that there is knowledge outside of science. Science just takes these things as input and then transforms them into knowledge. So our ordinary ways of forming beliefs aren't yet epistemically very good. They aren't yet cases of knowledge. They only become knowledge through the scientific process. Something like that. And if that's right, then the point would be science doesn't need to rely on extra scientific sources of knowledge. It just sort of creates knowledge out of non-knowledge. But if you think about it, that's sort of a mysterious view. Because it seems that, well, in epistemology, as elsewhere, the principle garbage in, garbage out holds. Right? If you start with something that has very little or no epistemic quality, something that is not knowledge, then just by performing some further operations on it, inferring other beliefs from it, or sort of using it as input to an argument, that's not suddenly going to increase the quality of that epistemic quality of that belief. Right? If I make an observation and that observation doesn't have a lot of epistemic quality, then by basing other beliefs on that observation, I'm not going to get knowledge. How would that happen? Epistemic quality doesn't just appear out of nothing. So that it does seem that we're going to need to say something very positive about the input beliefs of science, and we're probably going to need to say that they are knowledge if we're going to get scientific knowledge out of the scientific process. So So here's sort of a further way, or maybe a sort of different way to develop this worry. So here's sort of, I want to look at sort of certain features of science that people often emphasize to explain why science is such a great form of knowledge, or such an adult form of knowledge, if you will. Of course, it's true that science sort of doesn't take any kind of observation as input. It sort of systematically filters, repeats, and confirms observations, right? Science isn't just randomly looking out in the world. It's being really careful about how you observe things and trying to do it a number of times and, well, repeating them, having other people sort of verify it. So there's a lot going on in science, and you might think that these things are the things that are responsible for turning non-knowledge into knowledge. So let's consider that. The first thing to say, if this is the line here, that these things, so systematic observation, repeatability, if these are supposed to be unique features of science, which sort of uniquely turn scientific knowledge into the best quality of the best sort of knowledge that we have, then it does seem like a lot of everyday beliefs have this same quality too, right? If I live my life, I do a lot of sort of repeated observations of everyday mundane things. Every time I step outside my house, it turns out that my car is right there, and my house still looks the same, and my children sort of, they still have the same names. So all of these beliefs would also be sort of confirmed in a very systematic and repeated fashion. So these everyday beliefs are going to have the same qualities as those scientific beliefs. So, if this is the line, then the adherent of scientism is going to have to grant, it seems, that there is extra scientific knowledge to the extent that we're doing repeated and systematic observations outside of official science. But moreover, I actually think that this point about systematic observation, it merely reaffirms the idea that there must be knowledge outside of science, because merely sort of repeating observations is not going to do anything if these observations are not of high quality. So we're still relying on knowledge outside of science if this is what makes scientific knowledge so high quality. You're going to need epistemically good observations, and the fact that you repeat them doesn't mean that they can be of lesser quality all of a sudden. In fact, they need to be of good quality if knowledge is going to come out, because again, garbage in, garbage out. So a third worry, or sort of another way in which people sort of emphasize how science is so uniquely good, intersubjective verification. So the same sort of idea as the systematic filtering. Scientific beliefs are supposed to be intersubjectively verified. So it's not just me, it's a lot of people. And sort of it's open to anyone in principle. Anyone, if he or she has the right sort of formal training, can go through the steps required to make these scientific observations, and that's the way in which knowledge can be produced. Again, my reply is going to be sort of the same. If this is supposed to be a unique feature of scientific beliefs, then it seems that there's a lot of intersubjective verification going on outside of science, and also the fact that a lot of people make the same observation doesn't all of a sudden sort of change that observation into something epistemically better if the observations that these people make aren't very good, don't have a lot of epistemic quality in the first place. So again, this relies on the idea that there is epistemic quality, epistemic authority, knowledge outside of science. Right. So what does this mean for the adherent of scientism? So let's sort of take a step back here. The general picture is this. We have lots of everyday beliefs that we form through everyday modes of forming beliefs. And these beliefs, it seems to me, are perfectly acceptable, perfectly reliable cases of knowledge. We know a lot of everyday things very well. And in fact, not only do we know them, there doesn't seem to be a lot that science could do to sort of improve our knowledge here. is a scientific inquiry into the names of my children really going to make me epistemically better off? I don't really see that. Or, if some scientists were to start inquiring what I had for breakfast yesterday, is that going to somehow improve my epistemic situation? I don't see it. Of course, these aren't very deep or profound or important beliefs. Nonetheless, they are beliefs that all of us have and that all of us rely on in our everyday lives. But if this is the correct picture, then this puts pressure on the idea that science is this absolutely authoritative source of knowledge, that we should only or preferably rely on science where it's available. Because, first of all, science must rely on these extra scientific beliefs, extra scientific cases of knowledge. And also lots of our everyday beliefs, these extra scientific cases of knowledge, wouldn't be any better off if they were somehow confirmed by science. So, maybe there's no strict contradiction here with the definition of scientism that I gave you, but it does seem that the picture it gives us, so that it's always preferable to rely on science, just seems wrong-headed. Now, the adherent of scientism might say, well, wait a minute. These things that you've been talking about, so these ordinary ways of forming beliefs, they are not extra scientific. No, they are part of science. So, of course, ordinary perception is part of science. Memory is part of science. Testimonies or learning from others is part of science. I don't know. This is something the adherent of scientism might say. But the question is anything left then that's still, that's still an interesting and substantive claim, an interesting version of scientism? Because, my worry is if all of our everyday modes of forming beliefs are supposed to be science, then we're simply stretching the meaning of the word science beyond recognition. If just opening your eyes and looking around you is supposed to be science, then all of us are we're all scientists. And I guess many of you in this room will actually be scientists, given that you're listening to talks about scientism. But all people everywhere are scientists. Well, that just seems this isn't a useful definition of the word science anymore. Moreover, it starts to look like scientism becomes this trivial thesis now, right? If just sort of finding out about the world by looking at it and sort of listening to others, if all of that counts as science, then scientism apparently is nothing more than doing what we did all along and relying on all these everyday modes of belief formation, and also, of course, on sort of more strictly things that are science in a more strict sense. But this isn't a very interesting and controversial thesis anymore. It just sounds like common sense, what we've been doing all along. But then, what is scientism and why is it supposed to be an important thesis? Right, so second criticism. And this is something that we briefly touched upon. So the criticism is that scientism is self-referentially incoherent. It's kind of a big word, but I'll explain what it means. So scientism, as I've defined it, and as James Ladyman defines it, is what you might call a belief-forming policy, or an ethics of belief, if you will. So it gives you practical advice on how to form your beliefs. So what sort of things to trust, what things to distrust. So to regulate your intellectual lives, as it were. Now, scientism itself seems to be a belief. If you're an adherent of scientism, you're going to think that science is absolutely authoritative and that it has no, in principle, limits. Or you're going to think, maybe some slightly modified, you're going to think that the sort of practical advice that scientism gives is the best advice or the correct advice. So it does seem like scientism either itself is a belief, or at least can be formulated as a belief, or maybe presupposes certain scientific beliefs. But then, if the adherent of scientism is consistent, she should follow her own advice, right? That doesn't seem too much to ask. But then the question is, well, what about scientism itself, belief in scientism? Is that something that science tells you? Because science is supposed to be absolutely authoritative, so you're supposed to form your beliefs by relying on science. Well, then, if you're going to follow scientism, if you're going to think scientism is the truth, then there better be some scientific evidence for it. But of course, well, I mean, there isn't, or at least at first sight, there isn't. I mean, it's not as if you can sort of browse through recent issues of Nature or Science and, find articles there that will tell you that scientism is the right belief policy to adopt. It doesn't seem like science is in the business of investigating these belief policies. I mean, it's something that epistemologists do or philosophers, but scientists typically aren't engaged in these sorts of inquiries. So that's why I say there's a self-referential form of incoherence here. Right? So if you apply scientism's own advice to itself, you should probably, it looks like you're going to have to give up your belief in scientism, or at least not be very confident about it. So again, there's not a strict contradiction here because of the way scientism has been defined, but it's sort of an embarrassing situation, right? I mean, presumably for the adherent of scientism, belief in scientism is a very central belief of hers. It's sort of the central rule for how to lead your intellectual life. But then it turns out when you ask the adherent of scientism to justify this very central belief of hers, she's going to have to revert to non-scientific evidence. She's going to have to revert to doing philosophy. Well, that's kind of embarrassing, right? The advice is to rely only on science, and then when asked to justify that advice, someone has to start doing philosophy. So that's a bad thing, it seems. Okay, so you might think, well, this is a little too quick, because isn't there sort of an indirect and at least broadly scientific argument for scientism? Namely, the argument from the success of science, also something that was mentioned briefly before. So the argument would be, science has been immensely successful in finding out truths about ourselves and the world, and therefore, if we want to find out more truths about ourselves and the world, we ought to rely on science, or at least preferably, we ought to rely on science. So science is sort of the best way of forming beliefs that we have, very successful, and therefore we should rely on it. Well, maybe that's not sort of a scientific argument in the strict sense. It's not something that falls out of empirical experiments, but at least sort of it's in the spirit of science, right? It's sort of gathering evidence, comparing different ways of forming beliefs, and then drawing conclusions about which ones are the most effective. So it's broadly scientific. Now, so there's sort of a quick side note. It might not be very easy to establish that science has been immensely successful, because, I mean, as we all know, science is a fallible enterprise, and sort of when you look at the actual track record of science, it seems that a lot of scientific theories from the past have turned out to be false. I mean, this is sort of, I mean, it seems to be the sort of thing that has been going on for, since the start of science. So that's pretty good inductive evidence for thinking that current science is going to be false to a large extent. So it looks like, to get the result that science has been immensely successful, you're going to have to be very careful in how you delineate sort of science and how you sort of compose the track record of science. For the philosophers of science, of course, this is what inspired Larry Loudon to formulate his pessimistic meta-induction, for the conclusion that we cannot endorse realism, so current science is most likely to be false. Also, a really interesting book about this, more recent, that I would recommend, is by a statistician called Samuel Arbesman, A-R-B-E-S-M-A-N. It's called The Half-Life of Facts. So in a way, he sort of gives empirical backup for this pessimistic meta-induction. So he looks at scientific publications and then looks at, so just in various fields, looks at scientific publications, and then looks at how many of those have later been either retracted or definitively been shown to be false or rejected for some other reason. And sort of by doing that, and it's just statistics, it turns out that there's sort of a pretty regular pattern to how sort of quickly science is, or sort of specific scientific claims are rejected. So you can sort of see something that looks like a fact at one point, a couple of years later, it's likely to be not a fact anymore. So interesting stuff, and this is going to create difficulties for anyone who wants to say that science has been immensely successful. Anyway, but let's assume that we can sort of get the track record straight, and of course there is something to the claim, right, that science has been very successful, because, well, it obviously has in a certain way. Now, of course, that science has been a successful source of knowledge, a very reliable source of knowledge, doesn't entail that it's the only one. This is a very simple, logical point. But the implication is that we need to supplement this basic argument about the success of science with further arguments to the effect that other ways of forming beliefs have not been as successful as science. Right? So we need a comparative argument saying that science really sort of comes out on top, whereas others are, well, below science. And that's a daunting project. First of all, because it's sort of difficult to see how you should carve up the different ways of forming beliefs. And science itself too isn't this unified thing, so you'd probably have to get more fine-grained and look at different fields of science. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. And what exactly is our ordinary ways of forming beliefs? How do you carve those up? That's something you really need to look into to establish the case that science has been more successful than ordinary ways of forming beliefs. And it looks like sort of a difficult thing to do, but suppose it can be done. Suppose you can really make a case that science has been much more successful, or at least more successful enough to come out as this superior source of knowledge. Would that then establish the truth of scientism? I don't think so. And this brings me to my third criticism. So actually sort of the third criticism maybe is sort of a follow-up to the second. So maybe there's actually two criticisms, depending on how you count. And this is, and I'll sort of explain what I mean by this again. Normativity seems to be inevitable, and specifically epistemic normativity. What do I mean by this? Well, think again about sort of how you would go about creating this track record argument that's supposed to show that science is a superior source of knowledge. So you start by making presumably sort of long lists of different ways of forming beliefs, and you look at cases in which knowledge was formed and cases where non-knowledge was formed for all these different ways of forming beliefs. And that's sort of the way you go about forming that track record argument. But how are you going to do that? How are you going to decide what the good cases and the bad cases are, what the cases of knowledge are and what the cases of non-knowledge are? So you make a long list of beliefs that were formed on the basis of ordinary perception. To get the track record, you need to decide which ones were cases of knowledge and which ones weren't. Right? Because that's going to allow you to compute the percentage of success. How do you do that? Well, presumably, it looks like, well, there are two options here. You can either come up with some general criterion which distinguishes between knowledge and non-knowledge, and then sort of apply that criterion in each individual case. Or you might think, well, I don't have a general criterion available, but I do have a solid intuitive grasp of what knowledge is and what isn't. So there's this famous quote by a Supreme Court justice who had to rule on pornography, and he said, pornography, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. So you might sort of take the same approach to knowledge, right? Can't define it, but I know it when I see it. But what's actually going on here? If you're going to give these general criteria for what knowledge is, so the first option, you're relying on normative epistemic principles of spelling out what knowledge is. Normative epistemic principles don't simply fall out of science. So you're relying on extra scientific sources of belief, sources of knowledge. On the other hand, if you're going to rely on your intuitive grasp, again, you're relying on something that's outside of science, because intuitions or epistemic intuitions about what knowledge is and what isn't, again, that's not something that you get from science. It's something outside science. So eventually, when you're trying to argue for the superiority of science, it does seem that you're going to have to rely on normative epistemic principles. And normative epistemic principles aren't the sort of things that science establishes or demonstrates. So again, you're relying on things outside of science. And so the same sort of move is available for the adherent of scientism as before. So the adherent of scientism might say, well, no, wait, I'm simply going to take these epistemic principles on board and say that they are part of science, or epistemic intuitions, also part of science. Well, if she's going to do that, then it's kind of unclear what scientism is, right? It seems that we're losing the connection with sort of actual real science there, and we're simply sort of incorporating philosophy into science, which, I mean, as a philosopher, that's wonderful and it's very friendly, but it's not clear that there's a distinctive scientistic thesis here anymore. Good. So the conclusion is, so far, and then I'll be brief about the final bit. Conclusion is, scientism, even in this sort of moderate form that I've given you and that James Ladyman defends, is untenable. It's not something you should endorse. It's probably false. Or, I mean, if you modify it, it's not an interesting thesis anymore. So, what now? What next? Well, one thing I want to emphasize quickly is that criticizing scientism isn't being critical of science. And this has come up before, but I just want to be clear about it. If you're saying that there's something wrong with scientism, you're not sort of a skeptic about science. You're not a relativist or a postmodernist or a fundamentalist or creationist or other sort of bad person. You're simply saying that science is wonderful, but it might not be the only thing that we ought to rely on in leading our intellectual lives. Now, I don't think that is the same as criticizing science. So, what is sort of a more appropriate or a better attitude to have in these matters? Well, unfortunately, I don't really have a catchy label or sort of a one-liner that summarizes the view, but it's sort of, in a way, it's sort of an uninteresting claim, but at least it has the advantage of being much more plausible, which should count for something, I hope. I think the best way to go about these things is to be, sort of pluralist, and to think, there's science. Science is, when construed in a certain way, is immensely successful. It's a great way for finding out truths about the natural world, about ourselves insofar as we are part of the natural world, about the universe, and that's wonderful. We should hold science in high regard. But we should also think that science uses certain ways of forming beliefs and sort of really refines them and is very systematic and careful about these ways of forming beliefs. Particularly, sort of, it relies on ordinary perception in a systematic way. It relies on memory, on testimony, sort of third-personal methods. Sort of you look at things from a third-person perspective, and that's wonderful. It's great. But there are other ways of forming beliefs, right? There is introspection, sort of the first personal perspective, sort of thinking about how you yourself feel. Maybe there's something like the second personal perspective. Michael talked about this very briefly. So sort of relating to other people, sort of empathizing with them, understanding their thoughts, their feelings. And that's another way of forming beliefs, forming knowledge even perhaps, that we use in everyday life. And it seems perfectly in order and okay for us to do so. So there's this sort of there's a broad spectrum of belief-forming methods or ways that we have, and I think sort of the best advice you can give is actually to use all of these in those situations in which they are appropriate. So as I said, not a very catchy thing to say, but it sounds right to me, at least. And of course, in doing this, we should always, have a critical attitude and not believe anything. We should exercise our common sense. Again, very sort of simple things to say, but probably correct. So I guess sort of on this rather uninspiring but hopefully true note, I want to conclude this talk.